Good evening, everyone. How are you? I hope you're doing well. I'm here with my trusty sidekick, Mr. Producer, and we rather wonderfully got a Shure microphone, which we're still learning out how to use. We should be uploading that in the near future. But for now, we're just going to do it with the spaces. I've been feeling a little bit under the weather lately, and it's been a kind of really just like one damn thing after another kind of week. And I'm not quite sure what to make of it all, to be honest with you. It's become a kind of, just basically a kind of crazy week. And I'm trying to figure out what I should be doing on a whole host of issues, not least of which is some of the things we're going to talk about tonight. Um, I recently got had a discussion with my agent from way back in the day. I wrote this book called Calvin Coolidge Matters, or Why Calvin Coolidge Matters. And I've kind of stayed in touch with the same agent all these years. And so he and I spoke today for the first time in God knows how many years. And he was very interested in publishing my novel, or helping to publish my novel. And so we're sort of going through the process of talking to the big five of the publishing houses, and it's a lot more fun than I recalled, than I remembered, and I'm having a great time of it. It's become a lot more fun than I thought it would be. Hold on just one second. I'm going to invite some people up. Mr. Producer, do you think we can just publish that entire list of topics so that up in the jumbotron? Why don't you tweet it out on your account, or we can tweet it out on my account, and then we'll share it up top. Just give me the thumbs up. Hold on one sec. Actually, you know what? I'll just post them. It's probably just easier so people know what we're talking about tonight. Let's see here. I have a few other kind of fun things to talk about. I'm going to go apple picking, of all things, tomorrow, which I'm pretty excited about. And let's see here. I don't know if anyone's been seeing some of the stuff that young Nicholas has been up to. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that, but hold up, let me post this. Just give me a second. So these are going to be the show notes for this evening, and the topics we're going to go through. Let's see here. One of the things that's kind of annoying about X is just like a lot of the user interface is not super helpful. I find that really annoying, to be honest with you. Let's see here. All right. I suppose what we could do, we could start the conversation this evening with a discussion about Gavin Wax. He's been kind of all over the news lately, and it would be kind of irresponsible not to talk about him. I've known Gavin a pretty long time now. He and I were kind of friendly, really in the first Trump administration. He's a friend of Matt Gaetz's, a nice guy. I've always liked him, personally, but apparently he has a stranger side, and we'll get into that in just a second. By the way, if you want to come up and join the conversation, we're happy to have you, and would love to kind of get the conversation going, but hold on a second. So when we're talking about Gavin, we're really talking about the degree to which Jewish power influences our conversation on these platforms. And we should be really kind of thinking about the degree to which a kind of group of pro-Israel Jews very much dominate a lot of organizations, particularly in New York City. And that's kind of how I always took him. He was a pro-Coolidge guy, but he was also a guy that was very tied into strange politics. I believe at one point he was an honorary consul for like the government of Hungary, which, as people know, is a very pro-Russian and a very pro-Israel outfit. What it seems to be, and maybe some people can correct me, but what it seems to me is that Gavin leaked the text messages as a kind of punishment, or as a kind of a sort of attack on a group that had effectively ousted him from the New York Republican scene. Now, that is pretty troubling if it's true, but it's kind of entirely within the character of Gavin Wax, who has become much more prominent, much more involved with the kind of Darren Beatty wing of Republican politics. By the way, I'm going to let some people up if people want to come speak. I see Granny is here. I see a few other folks are here. I want to kind of keep it more conversational this evening. But from my sort of impression of Gavin is that Gavin is the kind of guy who settles grudges, kind of thinks of himself as a kind of, how would I describe him? I would say that he's a kind of aggressive Zionist, a kind of tough Jew type, and he was upset about being passed over for leadership, and so he elected to leak a lot of these conversations. He tried to get the text messages and then leak them. Now, I'm generally of the view that one can leak text messages. I myself did it with then Senator, now Vice President Vance. And my view is that you can leak messages or private messages of people if there's a public interest, if there's a compelling reason to do that. And I think that there's, a sort of question here about whether or not these public messages of people that no one has ever really heard from, that's sort of, an open question here. Yeah, welcome, David.
Thanks for having me up.
I think you were one of the first to talk about this issue. You want to kind of fill people in on the background?
Yeah. I mean, I don't really know where to start. I'm kind of I'm waiting to start a podcast recording in a minute or two here. But yeah, I think I was, and it was because of what had happened in Kansas. I've got a lot of friends down in Kansas, especially involved with the Young Republican Club down there. And I had heard that a scandal was brewing, and somebody had sent me this Politico article. And, the Politico article goes over all of these supposedly scandalous text messages, which are, a bunch of younger guys kind of joking with one another. And so I called around to find out if, these were some kids that were actually involved with my church. And they were. And they were being slandered and smeared and lied about in the media. And so I kind of immediately felt defensive of these young guys having their careers, their livelihoods ruined. And so I kind of started digging and calling around some of my contacts. In 2023, I had, organized an unsuccessful takeover of the Young Republican Club of Idaho with a friend of mine, Vince James. And so I'd kind of gotten some contacts, one of those contacts being Gavin Wax, actually, who was attempting to help us take over the Young Republican Club here in Idaho. Gavin had kind of painted himself over the years as a kind of anti-establishment MAGA Republican that was there to help the Groypers in. And, dissident right people in, and to kind of, do away with the establishment. And it's starting to look a lot like a giant honeypot now. So that's kind of how I got involved with this whole scandal. And of course, now it's just a matter of, finding out what actually happened, who knew what, when, who sold who out, and why. And based on my sources, it all comes down to a very petty drama between Gavin and this guy named I can't even remember his name right now. Peter Gunta. Peter Gunta is the head of the New York State Young Republican Club, and there's a difference. Gavin was the chairman of the New York City Young Republican Club, and those two clubs had frequently been at odds with one another. And from what I understand, Peter was attempting to get Gavin perhaps off of the board of the committee because he was no longer a resident there in New York. and you have to live in the state where your club is. And so Gavin was very upset with this kind of insubordination, I think, that's how he saw it, and was seeking a way to get back at Peter. And from what I've been led to believe, Gavin exploited a Catholic guy in the group named Bartels. I think its name is Mike Bartels. I don't know him personally, but from what I've been told, he is a allegedly deeply closeted homosexual, and Gavin Wax threatened to reveal that, which would have put his career in jeopardy as a closeted guy. And so Bartels coughed up these chat logs, gave them to Gavin, and then Gavin sent them off to Politico. That's basically what I know.
We're friends for many years now that almost all Republican events, particularly young Republican events, are closet cases getting together, and that I was unfortunately too heterosexual for the Republican Party and had to leave it. And I think this is pretty much a kind of confirmation of that. That there's a kind of gay subplot here. There's a Jewish subplot here. There's sort of many different angles here. And of course, my understanding is that that our friend Gavin now works for Darren Beattie, and Beattie, of course, is not the biggest fan of yours truly. After I started talking about his strange Russian Jewish, his Russian wife back in the day, and Darren got funded by a lot of different groups to run a kind of blog, Revolver News, which pushed a kind of Likudnik line, and Gavin's very much maintained that position along with Darren at the Department of State. It's a very kind of interesting kind of development. It's sort of a kind of group of Jews pushing a kind of Likudnik line within our government. I think what I find interesting about this is that, first of all, if you're young, you should just assume everything you do on the phone is monitored, recorded, whatever. We live in a Pegasus world. Um, you should probably not be using Telegram, which is itself set up by the Russian world, has a lot of Israeli connections there as well. And I think it's kind of telling that, people thought they were free to speak candidly. Maybe it's a kind of bonding exercise to be like racist or sexist together, to joke around in that way. But yeah, I think it's pretty interesting. I think it has effectively led to the disbanding of the Young Republicans of the state of New York. Is that right, David?
Yes, from what I understand, the state party, the Republican Party of New York, has called for their disbanding. They tried to do something very similar in Kansas. However, the bylaws, from what I understand, did not actually allow them to disband the Young Republicans. So they are still kind of fighting to keep whatever they've got going over there together. But yes, that is what I understand.
I have to say the whole thing is kind of surprising to me. First of all, that there would be Republicans in New York City, or in New York generally, but a lot of those people seem very like white ethnic. They don't seem like your kind of normal, run-of-the-mill country club Republican types, and so there's a kind of like question here of the quote unquote Groyperization of the Republican Party. I personally find this idea that people have that they're entitled to anonymous speech to be kind of ridiculous, particularly when they're engaging in politics. But I do think that these are kind of low level people. So it's kind of like they're not really significant enough to out in this way. And, I think in general, I would agree with JD Vance's claim that we should kind of give young people some grace. Then again, if you kind of conceal this stuff, you kind of create opportunities in which people can be blackmailed later on. So I think it's probably all to the good that all this came out as it did.
I mean, I would generally agree with you. I had a long phone call with one of these younger guys that got caught up in it. And, he's very upset. The press was at his house. Antifa doxed him. He felt very much under threat and almost like his life was over. And I talked to him on the phone for about an hour and a half, and it was very encouraging to him that this is not the end, but there are some obvious lessons to be learned here, and um, you know, basically trying to encourage him that this wasn't the last chapter in the book, but this is maybe the first chapter of being betrayed, and now it's all about how you handle this going forward. Because a lot of the comments that were made in the group chat really aren't even that scandalous, and you can break it down based on who said what. Not everybody in that chat was praising Hitler. Not everybody in that chat was talking about throwing people into gas chambers. Some people were just saying, "Hey, what's up, nigga?" As these Zoomers do. That is kind of within their lexicon of verbiage, with years of rap culture and whatnot going on. So I think that there are different degrees for each. I think each person's case kind of needs to be weighed and measured individually. And I do think that the left kind of going at this group with the 2014 era of canceling based on association is goofy. And
Yeah,
you know
it seems very dated in general. My impression
yeah.
is that the youth are a lot more like race conscious and a lot more like quote unquote racist than kind of our generation was. I don't know what your sense is, David, but
I mean, I
my
think so. I mean, like for me anyway, like when I was growing up, in Cleveland and all these different places, I you might have had like one or two black students in the school with you. But nowadays, growing up in schools, it's much closer to 50-50 in a lot of parts of the country, if not being an outright, white minority. And that definitely does do something to your psyche. Um, and I think that these kids have kind of, adopted verbiage, adopted language, and a worldview that is different than the millennial generation. That's for sure.
it is interesting. I mean, I think aren't pretty much all of the people who got busted, aren't they kind of all non-Jews? It's kind of my
And not just non-Jews, but most of them are pretty faithful Catholics, from what I understand. Which is, again, one of the reasons why I even got involved in this, is because I know a few of these people through the kind of traditional Catholic network. The amount of people that are traditional Catholics that pray the Rosary and go to the old Mass. It's a very small pool of people, and so you kind of become aware very quickly of other people throughout the country that are interested in politics or involved at some level. And so that's kind of how I got brought into this whole thing.
and the reporter who wrote this piece, I guess there's two of them. There's Emily Ngo, NGO, presumably Asian, and who is this Jason Beeferman?
Well, he's Jewish.
So we have a Jewish guy, Gavin Wax, leaking material to another Jew at Politico, a publication that's owned by Axel Springer, which makes criticism of Israel a fireable offense. So Politico, of course, is a very pro-Israel outlet, and has become kind of a place where a lot of Likudnik kind of people can interact. And so it seems to me what we have here is a kind of op, as it were, to kind of change the landscape of future leaders of the Republican Party, of New York and elsewhere. I don't know how much this will have any real effect long run, because I don't really think any of these people were kind of destined for leadership roles necessarily, but I think it probably affects them on the margin in certain ways. Maybe career wise, it's probably embarrassing to have their name Googled and have a political article come up. But I mean, I think in general, my view, for what it's worth, is that when you are exposed saying things that you kind of wish you hadn't said, kind of the best thing to do is dilute it by just doing other things. And so my view has always been, get hundreds of articles written about you, all of which are some of which are real, some of which are fake, and as a kind of way of drowning out some of this stuff over the years. I myself was attacked in Politico, no less, by um, this woman. What was her name? Johnson. When I was defending this Jewish reporter there, when I was defending Darren Beattie back in the day, after Beattie got fired for his association with some kind of far right, white nationalist adjacent organizations. So I think it's kind of interesting how you're kind of allowed to be, saying pro Hitler things or pro race realist things if you're a Jew, but you're not really allowed to do that if you're a Catholic, right? I think that's kind of the kind of double standard argument aspect of this. I don't know if anyone else, wants to weigh in. I see Granny's here. Welcome, Granny.
Hi, welcome back, Uncle Chuck.
Good to be back. I sort of have a lot of things going on at once, and so my general sense, for what it's worth here, is that I think this story isn't terribly going away, although I think it's really about the kind of double standards that exist within the Trump world generally. It's surprising to me that Wax is, keeping his job at the Department of State. I mean, if he's leaking confidential and private messages, he's leaking those to reporters. That's a bit suspect, right? One should be kind of careful that he's not doing that in other ways as well.
Right. I mean, I think that this should call Gavin's character into question as far as, working around sensitive areas, different things, maybe they're foreign policy or, state policy, or, maybe he's gathering information on the Trump administration. Maybe he's going to prepare a hit piece on one of his superiors if he feels as though his job is threatened, or perhaps his political future is threatened. So the guy should at this point be viewed as radioactive and kind of a wild card and definitely untrustworthy. But there's another angle of this thing too, and I forgive me, I can't remember which particular Zionist organization he was working for, whether it was the AJC or the WJC. I think it might have been the AJC. But from what I understand, he had a seat on the council. And I do know that he has done a lot of liaising, getting business, placing advertisements on behalf of these Jewish Zionist groups. And so, that's kind of another angle of this thing is, was he always kind of this hangout? Was he always kind of this kind of honeypot that was going to be tolerant for years of the, Groyper, Nick Fuentes, alt-right types of people? And so, that's where, I come back to this bit about his beef with Peter Gunta, where it's like, on the one hand, I don't think necessarily that it was a hit designed to take out like a bunch of low-level comms directors in Kansas or Arizona. I really do think that this was just petty beef back and forth between him and Peter Gunta. But for sure, he viewed these other young Catholic people, young Christians that were, trying to make America great again, trying to, make the Republican Party, putting, America first. He viewed these people as completely expendable. And literally at the first moment that he threw all of them under the bus without any compunction or remorse.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible, like what he was sort of involved with here. It's pretty, it's kind of disturbing, kind of the more I tuck into it.
The other thing that's worth looking at, Chuck, if you have time, and I'm not looking at it right now, but if you look at the board of directors of the New York Young Republican Club, you'll see a lot of names that are very familiar. And these are all people that were on the board. I believe Don Jr. is on the board. Darren Beattie is on the board. Raheem Kassam is on the board. And so you've got a lot of these kind of high profile media people serving on the board of directors of a young Republican club in New York City. And then, as soon as Trump won, I mean, I guess this is just like one of the ways that politics and appointments works, but, Trump wins and then Gavin gets his ticket punched and gets a job in the administration. So I do think that's another interesting kind of angle to look at here.
Beattie's also on the board.
Yes.
Is that true? Bibi Netanyahu is on the board of the New York Republican Club?
Beattie.
Who?
Darren Beattie.
Oh, Beattie.
Darren
Okay.
Beattie.
I was going to say that's a bit much, even for me, like having a.
Now, I do know that the Young Republicans of like the national organization of the Young Republicans, I believe it was in 2020 or 2021, they actually hosted a conference that was a joint meetup between the Young Republicans and Young Likud. Which is kind of interesting that they would be that open and brazen about that. I believe I have a screenshot saved on my phone somewhere. It has since been scrubbed from their website, but there was not much room really between the Young Republican Club and the Likud Party, even just a couple of years ago.
Well, I think it's also interesting, right? That my understanding is Gavin Wax was slated to go be at the FCC. Is that your understanding too? He was slated to go work there at one point.
Yes. Yeah, I was actually kind of confused as to where he worked. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess he works at the State Department. Is that right?
My understanding is he works under Darren Beattie.
Yes.
If people want to put that up, and Darren is at the State Department, and so on the FCC side of it, it's curious that like we're in this environment where Jimmy Kimmel, gets kind of brought down by the FCC. That there's this sort of like use of these government agencies to target specific people, to come after certain people, and some of that is to have some retribution from Donald Trump, but a lot of it seems to me that a lot of Donald Trump's supporters are using the imprimatur of some of these organizations to go after people. Now, do we know, has Wax said anything since then, or what do we know?
I think he's talking to lawyers right now. I haven't heard anything.
He hasn't tweeted. He did retweet Darren Beattie 5 hours ago, but that looks like about it as far as his Twitter activity. Anyway, he hasn't tweeted in several days at this point.
What did he do with Darren Beattie?
His retweet of Darren Beattie is congratulating Sarah Rogers, who was confirmed as Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy at State. And I believe that Sarah, and then of course the tweet that Gavin retweeted. So Gavin retweeted Darren, who quote tweeted Blake Neff, who took a selfie with Sarah Rogers. And so, yeah, now she is the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy at the State Department.
My recollection is Blake Neff is the one who worked for Tucker Carlson that got fired.
That is correct. He was Tucker Carlson's producer.
And he was fired for some allegedly racist statements as well, right?
I believe, if memory serves, he was fired amidst the Grinch comments. You'll recall Tucker Carlson called a particular Jewish staffer of his a Grinch around Christmas time, and she filed a lawsuit against Tucker. And I believe that Blake got caught up in that. This was, of course, just after the George Floyd riots. I might be conflating the two. I'm not 100% on that. But for sure, Blake Neff was the one that was writing all of his monologues during the George Floyd stuff.
I know you said this is a honeypot, and this is, a crazy question, but do you guys feel that this was all then a big honeypot to get these guys, set them up, and a lot of that stuff was prompted? In these group chats, I see there's certain people that are suspicious, and then they'll start the conversation and get people and egg them on to just do this conversation. So do you feel this was the whole goal of this to begin with, David?
I don't personally. I don't personally think that, but for sure, this guy who's allegedly a homosexual, this Mike Bartels? I need to Google it. The Young Republicans scrubbed all reference to him yesterday. Actually, when I was recording my podcast, Michael Bartels, and so he's allegedly gay or whatever. And from what I understand, he was just the weakest link in the group chat because he was in the closet. And so Gavin was able to pressure him into turning over the chat logs. So from what I understand, excuse me, From what I understand, this was like a group of young people from across the country that saw what was going on with the establishment, that saw this kind of close relationship with the Likud party, with the pro-Israel stuff, and they wanted to get involved with the young Republicans to try and change that. And so I think that they thought and were in a private group chat, and that after the fact, when Gavin heard about that this group chat existed, then blackmailed Bartels as a way of getting back at Peter Gunta. And again, Peter Gunta was the chairman of the Young Republican Club of New York State, and I believe had kind of gone after Gavin at a couple of these state committee meetings. And I think really the issue was that there was a Trump rally where Peter Gunta got a picture with Donald Trump and Gavin Wax didn't. And Gavin was pissed about that and wanted to get back at Peter. And that is the basis of this thing, that it was like all petty drama and that it wasn't, in fact, some honeypot thing. But, hey, anything's possible.
And is our impression that that Gavin is going to lose his job, or what has been the response from the White House itself?
From what I understand so far, the White House hasn't commented on anything other than the J.D. Vance tweet. And then I believe J.D. went on the Charlie Kirk podcast and, said that this was all kid stuff and that we need to, give these kids some grace. There is kind of an ongoing pressure campaign now being led by myself and people at AF Post who are trying to get Gavin fired and trying to make basically the case that this kid is untrustworthy and he's going to backstab you. So he should be not in the administration.
Now, are there other examples of Gavin behaving in this underhanded way that we know of?
Oh, yes. Many times. There are all kinds of tweets and text messages that are floating around on the internet now where Gavin has threatened to dox and out people for anti-Semitism, for their Israel opinions, and other various and sundry things over the years. And so you can kind of Google or search his name in Twitter, and I'm sure find some stuff. I'll see if I can pull up the tweets that I'm specifically thinking of.
Raheem Kassam has been kind of his attack dog while he's been silent. If you just dig into his replies, he's been doing all the defending on the timeline.
I saw Raheem. I saw him at Kassam. I saw him at the ballet on whatever it was. I think it was last week, or at the Russian ballet for Unegin. And it was a very kind of strange place to see him because it was a very Russian heavy kind of thing. And
Russians love ballet.
they do, but what's interesting to me about it is, there's a lot of strange stuff with like the kind of people who go to these young Republican events. I mean, we have Roger Stone, very famously, has been involved in all kinds of strange Russia, gay, Israel subplots, and so there's a degree to which a lot of these young events are penetrated by foreign intelligence and foreign players. And I think that that's sort of something we also need to be kind of thinking about as we kind of engage here.
Well, he's a self-described trisexual. Roger's also, I think, at 24, he ran for some sort of position within, or at one point was the director of the Young Republican Federation, which is like basically the network controller of all these chapters. So he's been around for quite some time. The New York club is obviously one of the bigger nodes. So you can think of him kind of like a Teal for young Hill people, young blood on the Hill.
This is incredible. If somebody else could check this out, I am unable to search Gavin Wax on Twitter. Every time I try to search his name, it keeps coming up with posts aren't loading right now. So I'm unable to go back and find any of these past tweets.
Yep, I can confirm.
Yeah, I wonder if they kind of turned off search functionality for his name. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, I can't find it either, which is interesting. So yeah, it does seem like that was just done, as a kind of favor to some of the people. It's a strange development. Now, it seems to me that Wax is clearly some kind of Israel asset player. I know he was at one point working with the government of Hungary, and I know that there was a guy around him who was working with some sketchy players out of Brazil. But my impression of this sort of organization is it was kind of an extremely kind of controversial group within young Republican circles, the New York City version of it. That's at least my impression of it.
Yeah, he gave speeches at CPAC Hungary several times, from what I understand, and was very close with certain leaders from Alternative for Deutschland. So he was very well connected with these kind of right-wing political groups in Europe, from what I understand, and was kind of a I'm not as I'm living in Idaho. I don't really know exactly what he was doing there, but there was definitely a connection there. All kinds of trips that he was taking to Europe. He was taking Republicans over to Germany. I know I've got a friend who was an elected representative who went on a trip to Germany with him, and so he did definitely have a lot of connections with these kind of alt-right parties or whatever you want to call them over in Europe. But of course, Alternative for Deutschland, very pro-Israel. Just a few months ago, they shut down their youth wing, the youth wing of the Alternative for Deutschland, as well as in France. I believe there were some issues, and Hungary, of course. Viktor Orban has a long history with some of the same political consultants that got Bibi Netanyahu put into office. Which is kind of another interesting angle of this whole thing.
Well, if you look at, I think it's the Danube Institute and the Hungarian Conservative, you'll find former tenant media players such as Dave Rubin headlining some of their conferences. You also find part of this NatCon network is the MCC, which is like one of their based in trad conservative outlets. They hosted Tucker Carlson and I think Dennis Prager, I believe, but they are all over this scene.
My impression is it was Art Finkelstein who was the guy who had helped Orban come to power, as well as Bibi Netanyahu. And yeah, you're quite.
And he ran Ronald Reagan's campaign too, and I believe he's the one that came up with the catchphrase "Make America Great Again."
Yeah, it's interesting, the kind of Russian connections as well there. I know Noid had sent some stuff that I put up at the Jumbotron that could be, the sort of images there of people taking hors d'oeuvres with Russian and Ukrainian flags on them. Kind of interesting in that respect. My sense of it, for what it's worth, is that I think we're going to see a lot more of these kind of doxing things into the future. And my sense is that as the Israeli support diminishes among Republicans and Democrats alike, you're going to see a lot more of these kind of text message scandals, particularly because a lot of Zoomers live their lives online, and they sort of think of themselves as being among friends. My general sense too is that if you're using a platform like WhatsApp, which is notoriously buggy with the Israelis, or Telegram, you're also going to potentially make yourself vulnerable for leaks in other ways as well.
It seems search is down across the board, not just on Wax. So, as an update.
Okay, my paranoia is showing.
Now, I think, unless anyone else wants to say anything else, I think we probably exhausted that. I think it's kind of useful to kind of know. There was this piece today that came out about House oversight staffer says the rumor came from Steve Bannon that Jeffrey Epstein worked for intelligence. The House Oversight Committee yeah, Alex Acosta said that he never said that Jeffrey Epstein belonged to intelligence, which is, likely true that he belonged to intelligence. But that, yeah, it seems to me there's a lot of like interesting angles there around this. And here we go. Yeah, I'm going to share the thread from Jacob Shamsian. My impression of it, for what it's worth, and I've said this before, is that Epstein ended up being helpful to U.S. intelligence at the end of his life, and that ultimately he was jailed because the Netanyahu crew wanted him dead because of his relationship with Ehud Barak, the former prime minister. And it's interesting, I've had a number of people reach out to me recently saying that I was, in fact, correct about a lot of these subjects, which is nice to see as time goes on. It's kind of fun.
What about George Santos and George Santos being released? What do you think about that?
Well, the question, of course, with George Santos is, was there some like Russian angle there? And that was always the question that I had with him. He had this relationship with this guy, Andrew Intrater, who is interestingly, he was a business associate, and I believe he was the cousin of Victor Vekselberg. And Victor Vekselberg, of course, is the guy who was behind Gawker, who was sort of backing Gawker in different ways. So the question I always had with both, with George Santos is, what was he really doing? Like, was he just ripping off Republicans to live the fast life? What was really going on there? And I think we don't really know yet. I think it's kind of an open question still. What is interesting to me is that he ended up being in the shoe in large measure because there was supposedly some kind of death threat that Project Veritas had discovered. And I find that kind of interesting and fascinating. And then, of course, there's the role of Marjorie Taylor Greene in helping to get Santos have his sentence commuted. I was sending some messages earlier with the pardon staff at the White House or at Main Justice today, and this has apparently been worked on for quite some time. And it's good to see. I think that Santos is out of jail. I don't think he really deserved 7 years in prison for what he was alleged to have done. And this question of him being a phony and a fraud, there's a lot of that going on in Congress and of both parties. That's sort of when you have a situation where people want to be in power, they're going to maybe fib a little bit, maybe steal some money here and there. I think that's a very common thing that we see in politics all the time. So the question of whether or not he deserves 7 years in jail, I think, is a really open one. I will say that I was surprised that it happened, but it does suggest that Trump is going to be a bit more discerning with these kind of things going forward.
She certainly seems more loyal than people like Rand Paul or Thomas Massey, even though she's sort of lumped in with them sometimes, which is interesting.
But she had ties to Milo too, right? A lot of ties to Milo.
Supposedly, Milo lived with her at one point too. It's my understanding of it, and that she lived with her, but no longer. And she was on the Tim Dillon podcast recently, and I do think she's much more of an inheritor of Trump's legacy than, say, a J.D. Vance is, for sure. I mean, she sort of owes her political career to being one of these MAGA types. I find her pretty compelling, personally. I wouldn't probably vote for her, but I find, I pay attention to what she's saying as a kind of barometer of where the base is in the Republican Party, and she's certainly a kind of archetype of a kind of MAGA mom type, and I've always found her pretty compelling and pretty interesting.
Doesn't she have ties to the Memphis mob down there or something like that?
Is it the Memphis mob? I thought it was just straight up Atlanta mob.
I
But yeah, I mean, I assume somebody who owns a construction company in Georgia would probably have hired an illegal alien or two in her life, to put it mildly. And I suspect, obviously, somebody who's involved in construction generally in the South is probably engaged in all kinds of slightly dodgy, slightly criminal enterprises. I suspect that that's kind of par for the course. Now, the question, of course, is she also a Fed, like Trump is a Fed? And I think she probably is. If you look at like her unusual split. And then I find it interesting, she was super close with Kevin McCarthy. Then Kevin McCarthy goes down. It's kind of fascinating, right? Matt Gaetz sort of takes him out. So I find all that stuff pretty interesting. These sort of like internal machinations, these kind of quiet politics within the party, you know? So I think that's kind of fascinating in its own right. So I think moving along on the show notes, let's see, Mr. Producer. I guess we only really did one of these, or did we? No, I give the updates. Yeah, so I guess the question I'm going to turn to the John Bolton indicted, setup here. I don't really believe that the John Bolton indictment is kind of the final word here. I think that there's probably a lot more stuff going on around John Bolton. If you'll recall, Bolton was one of the first people to use Cambridge Analytica when he was running for president back in the day. And he's had a close relationship with Rebecca Mercer over the years, who's funded a lot of things for him. So I think we're going to learn that there's a lot more going on with Mr. Bolton than just kind of like leaking some classifieds to his closer family members. I have to say I was surprised that they actually went forward with this indictment. And it could well be that the process itself is the punishment. That there's really not really an interest in actually jailing Bolton, but in fact, just kind of humiliating him and making his life difficult. I do think it's also interesting too that so historically, he has called for people to be executed for mishandling classified documents, and uh, that's pretty crazy, all things considered. Um, we should also be asking ourselves, why is it that Trump hired Bolton? And, Rebecca Mercer was pushing for him to hire Bolton, as was the late Sheldon Adelson. Um, and I think it's going to be curious to see how it really gets going. I will say, I think that it'll be useful to see kind of long run, what ends up happening with Bolton. Does anyone know who his attorney is on this case? Does anyone have a sense of it? My sense is I've heard that it's the same attorney that was being used by Hunter Biden. This kind of Abe Lowell guy. Um, I'm kind of curious if anyone knows. Yeah, so he's been consulting with prominent defense attorney A.B. Lowell. A.B. Lowell is a Jewish guy. He's very connected with the kind of Israeli Likud world, and he's certainly been a kind of lawyer that's been allowed to like ferry messages back and forth. So if I see Bolton with a A.B. Lowell, that's kind of a tell to me that he's in trouble, and he's certainly treating it like he's in trouble. A.B. Lowell is not a cheap attorney, so there's sort of questions there as well of what's going to go down with Bolton over the next bit. Let's see that he surrendered it voluntarily. And yeah, this is the point. Here we go. Patrick Byrne pointed this out, but that A.B. Lowell was Hillary's lawyer, and that he was also lawyer to the CFO of the Venezuelan mafia and other mafia figures. So there's this question I always have whenever you see one of these legal cases. It's like, who's the lawyer? Where do they come from? What are they about? What are they pushing? I think all of that's kind of useful to see as well. So yeah, I think it's a useful question to see as time goes on. I think the other thing, somebody pointed this out to me as well while we're on the legal side. that Florida or that jurors handed an award of up to $52 million against Felix Sater, who was found liable for laundering millions of dollars stolen from the city of Almaty, Kazakhstan, and the BTA Bank. And here we go. I'll put this up as well. So yeah, we're starting to clean out a lot of these kind of compromised players. I think it's going to be kind of useful to see as time goes on, as these things really shake out in different ways. In my own particular case, as people know, I have a $71 million judgment against me from a kind of bogus case in Texas. And it looks like that case, it's pretty clear now, was being funded by people around Elon Musk, maybe even Musk himself. And so some of that's going to come out, in the briefs that I'm filing with the Fifth Circuit, who has taken up the case, and that'll take place November 3rd or so, later this month, or I guess next month. Don't worry, I've got it. If people are worried about it, they shouldn't be. It's going to be fun to see and watch it as it shakes out. Let's see here. Any other big ones?
I'd like to talk about the Joe Rogan, the guy from on there. Pretty please. I was just listening to that.
Oh, the on roll stuff.
Yes, sir. Please.
All right, let's do that. Let's do that one. I want to keep it somewhat truncated tonight. So we'll go for like maybe another hour or so. I have to get up early to go apple picking, of all things, tomorrow. And I promised a young lady friend of mine that I would go apple picking with her and some other friends. So I want to be rested. I want to be in good apple picking form. And especially I guess it was 2 years ago, I went apple picking, and I ate so many apples that I was like kind of sick for a week. But anyway, yeah, go ahead, Granny. We can go there if you want to go there. What did you think? I mean, people know that I know Palmer. Palmer and I, used to be closer friends, I guess would be the way I would describe it. I like Palmer for what it's worth. I don't agree. I don't agree with like how Anduril is being run, and I don't agree with the Palantir Anduril kind of side of things. I think most of these companies are somewhat fraudulent and fake, but they may serve a sort of larger function. But what was your impression, Granny, of watching that Rogan interview? I haven't. I confess, I watched a little bit of it. I watched the Trey Stevens interview with the guy Sean Ryan, who was the ex Navy Intel CIA man, and I watched that the other night. And I've been working on this piece for a while. Maybe people can help me on it, called like why Silicon Valley has to steal Middle Earth. And it's sort of about the way in which Silicon Valley kind of raids Middle Earth looking for names for its companies. And so I'm kind of curious what your read is on all that, Granny.
Well, I watched about the first 30 minutes of it. Our little buddy Marie sent it to me and with a little tip. And they pass off a lot of false information that's not verified off of Twitter as news, and they kind of catch it. They use these tiny robots by China, and it just was very over the top. But like I said, I was just watching it, and I saw it was in your Jumbotron. So it's a very good interview. I would recommend at least watch that first 30 minutes like I have. And yeah, it's a little overwhelming, kiddo.
Well, it's interesting. There was this article, I think, recently saying that the U.S. Army saw Palantir and Anduril as not reliable software, not reliable technologies. And I think that that's going to ultimately be the kind of kiss of death of both of those products, which we're going to kind of see play out over the next bit. My impression is that Anduril, is having trouble getting contracting officers to award it money, and that's sort of a thing that's been playing out as well. That the company is sort of struggling getting production contracts and all of that. And I think that we're going to see more of this as time goes on. I'm generally kind of curious about this Erebor company as well that Palmer's doing, where he's like owning his own bank. I think that's going to be an extremely fraught situation. So yeah, I think we're going to see this whole thing kind of implode in the next few months. And
His sister, and what's his sister's name? She's got all those ties to that company in China, right?
which company in China?
The Angel company, I had it all wrote up in a tweet. I'll have to send it to you because his sister's got ties to one of the biggest angel companies in over there, kiddo. It's crazy.
Yeah, that would be news to me. I mean, I generally am very skeptical of a lot of these like high tech kind of plays. I generally, if you look at, there's this question of like on-roll drones having motors where they're made in China, and it's there's a lot of like strange stuff here. As these things play out, I think we're going to see much more of this stuff not stand up to scrutiny. And my concern generally is that, the public buys all of this stuff, and yeah, this is the key detail.
Yeah,
Um,
his sister worked with the CCP, Charles.
which sister?
The guy's the what's his name? Palmer's sister worked for the
He's got he's
CCP.
got he's got three sisters.
I'll have to look it up, honey. I've it's just on my phone, but I'll send it. I'll DM it all to you, kiddo.
Well, what's
Yeah,
interesting with the Tomahawk deal, they seem to be. Zelensky said he'll start selling his drone tech back to the states, which is interesting because it seems like a laundering scheme. Because if I understand, a lot of the tech that Lucky is pushing for is this drone tech, but is it just being laundered back to the states to make more money? I think that's kind
yeah.
of.
So what I understand is that much of the drone technology that exists is terribly Chinese. So a lot of the stuff that's deployed in Russia and in the Ukraine conflict is Chinese on both sides of it. And the Chinese are happy to sell drones to both sides because it gets them valuable intelligence as the drones fly around mapping everything, and it also is a kind of source of employment for a lot of Chinese, manufacturers. Um, my view on the Ukraine conflict, and I wrote about this today on my Substack. Mr. Producer, maybe we share that up in the jumbotron as well. Um, my view generally is that the Ukrainians and the Russians on both sides want this conflict to continue because it's sucking in all these resources. And I think that that's going to be a really important thing to really think through as time goes on, is this larger question of sucking in resources. And my sense on the tomahawk question is uh, is that the tomahawks are really about kind of escalating the conflict. And there's this idea, of course, that the Ukrainians are like heavily involved in everything. But really, Ukraine has benefited tremendously from all these resources that are going there. Now, of course, lots of people have died. Obviously wars are hell and they're terrible in all these ways. But the kind of leadership class in Ukraine has benefited tremendously from this conflict. And my view is that the technology that's been kind of most useful have been, kind of mortars, earlier technology that really came from the United States. And I think we have this other question too of like, if you give Zelensky tomahawks, what else could he use the tomahawks for, besides just the Russian angle? But my impression of it is that that whole purpose of that meeting today at the White House was to basically increase the pressure on Putin, to basically make it seem like Trump was mulling the question of giving him tomahawks. Should he give him tomahawks? Should he not? All of that. And in a way, the drones are kind of more effective. They're sort of capable of reaching larger range. So the question is, why do they need the tomahawks? And I think that is kind of a bigger kind of issue that we might think through. I, in general, am much more in favor of this guy Umerov, who is the sort of like he's a Crimean Turk, and he's the sort of defense minister, Rustem Umerov. And I'm much more of a supporter of his. I think he's a much more kind of impressive figure, and he was seated directly next to, seating directly next to Zelensky at the White House today. I think I have a good photo of them. Hold on, I'll put that up in the jumbotron as well. But generally speaking, I'm of the view that the real drone technology that the U.S. needs to be buying and supplying and going after in a serious way is domestic American drones. And then the other kind of outfit as well, the technology we could use is that we should also be doing is is pushing Turkish drone technology as well. I'm sort of the view that that is a much kind of better development in all these ways. So that's sort of how I look at it. I'm sure others have other thoughts on the Ukraine conflict. I think it's going to get increasingly difficult to support the Ukraine conflict if there aren't actual like serious elections at some point at some point as well. I think that's sort of something that needs to be sort of discussed. I think a lot of this will become kind of clearer as time goes on. But yeah, let me see here.
It's his sister Taylor. I sent it to you. And she worked with Bob Zoo and helped found the Zen Fund.
Oh, this is yeah, I've seen this. This is of course this is Joe Lonsdale's wife. Yeah, I'm aware of her. I've never met her, but I have met. Yeah, I've run into Gen Fund too, and they're very much a CCP outfit for sure. You're not wrong about that, but that's not Palmer's wife or sister. That's Joe Lonsdale, who's an investor. I believe he was a co-founder of Palantir, but that was a long time ago. And of course, none of these things are actually like really taking over or controlling the American primes because they really can't in a way because the American law is very clear in the John McCain National Security or Defense Act of 2019. Effectively, any director at any of the major agencies can decide that the technology is in fact not to be used, so or it has too many Chinese components. And so I think a lot of these tech guys are having a hard time actually selling into the government, notwithstanding the claims that they're making. But yeah, go ahead. Welcome, Sherry. So we've got Sherry up on stage. By the way, if anyone wants to come up and ask a question, or if they're more shy or whatever and want to use the super chats or use the messaging system, that'll be sort of helpful. I think in the next week or so, we're going to be setting up a kind of more formal podcasting studio. I'm sort of thinking through how that's going to look, how that's going to work. If you want to be a part of that, feel free to get a subscription on my Substack. I've been sort of putting my own capital in. Uh, I'm limited because I have this judgment against me that hasn't been overturned yet. So I can't actually use my own money for various things. It's quite annoying. But I'm moving in the right direction of overturning that as well. Let's see any other kind of big issue items. I think just generally speaking, the point I was making in the piece today that I wrote was that I think we should, Putin has talked a lot about Yaroslavl the Wise. He's talked a lot about this sort of history element here to suggest that there's this longer standing relationship between Russia and Ukraine, and that Ukraine is very much a part of Russia. And I would be inclined to agree with him, but I think the Russia leadership, back in the day was much more Scandinavian, much more of an earlier history. And so my interpretation of things is that the early settlers of Russia, the Rurikids, of which, I'm related to the Rurikid world as a, sort of my mother's side is much more Russian, Scandinavian. This is sort of like the White Russians. They tend to oppose Vladimir Putin in a lot of ways. And I think it'll be interesting to see if we really kind of take Putin seriously and are like, all right, let's go get a DNA test with you. Like you're claiming you're the new czar. Like which lineage are you familiar with? Which lineage are you a part of in Russia? And I think Trump should really take on Putin on these historical claims. And Putin is very afraid of having his DNA extracted. He goes to great lengths to hide his DNA in different ways. And I think we should be kind of aware of that as well. That's sort of something we should push back on. And one of the ways to do that is to sort of demand that he take did he take a DNA test?
Well, I did
So
notice that in one of the articles published by one of the more um, optimistic Atlanticists, that as soon as Trump started hearing Putin, I guess during their talk about history and all this, Trump threatened to leave multiple times because, as you say, the Russian revisionists, if you read what they're saying, they definitely have an angle. Everybody lauds the Tucker Carlson interview as Putin was this this classically trained Russian historian, just went on for hours and hours. This
It's more like filibustering.
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
It's
and
it's
and a lot of it was wrong too. I mean, that's the other thing about the history aspect
Yep.
of it. Like, I wrote about this at the time, talking about the sort of history, and there's a Turkic scholar whose name escapes me right now that Putin is very enamored of, who suggests that Russia is very much a kind of more of a Turkic power, and that there's a sort of steppe component of it as well. My view, for what it's worth, is that the Rurikids, and that whole history there, that's very much a Scandinavian project, and that we've in effect over the last few hundred years or so been under a kind of German occupation, whether it's German Jewish in the form of the Bolsheviks, or whether it's German in the form of the various czars. We've been under a kind of German occupation of Russia, and that's sort of like what has led to a lot of these conflicts and issues. Yeah, go ahead, Philip.
Hey, so I was just looking at the title of the space. It says you can't relax around the wax. I'm wondering if that's related to the leaked chat logs.
Yes,
And
yes, we
I,
discussed that a bit earlier in the sort of discussion. Happy to basically we had this view that what Wax was doing was quite perfidious, and that there should probably be some sort of consequences for his behavior. And that was sort of the argument that we sort of settled out at. If you look up at the jumbotron, you'll see a thing that says "Show Notes," and we've been sort of going through those show notes as well. But happy to address any questions there. But go ahead.
yeah, I mean, I personally, I feel like there's a lot of, basically white kids who join the Republican Party, and it's because they actually are seeing things on kind of a racial worldview. And they get the feeling that, white people are getting shit on as a race. This is a big part of, the anxiety that a lot of white people have about this mass immigration that's going on. It seems to be deliberate. Everyone agrees that this is going to result in our extinction, and that's just fine. And they're looking for political ways to address this issue. But I think what is proven by this leak, and the fact that, of course, the GOP is disbanding that organization, things like that, is that really the GOP is not an appropriate place for these people. The GOP is never going to be willing to listen to white people concerned about, the destiny of white people, or having any kind of racial worldview at all. That simply does not belong in the, so-called polite company of the GOP. They really only want to hear, if any race is going to have advocacy, it's going to be Jews, and it's only going to be Jews. There's no room for any other people.
Yeah, I
Um,
don't
so
disagree with your sense of that, although I think I would probably put it a different way, which is that I think that these guys, they're all kind of white ethnics, right? There's nobody in there who's a son of the American Revolution. There's really nobody in there that's a kind of WASP in any meaningful way. So when people talk about like white identity, I don't often know what they're actually talking about. And I think the whole concept of a white identity is kind of a bit of a misnomer, because we have all these different ethnic groups that are out there. My just general sense when it comes to this issue general, is that it's a kind of fashionable thing, a kind of in-group signaling to be kind of low-key racist among Gen Z, and it's a kind of way of basically building a kind of intimacy in these chats when you're kind of using that kind of language. And I think, unfortunately, that language then becomes useful for other actors, namely, Jews who are advancing their own interests, to blackmail people or harm people over that kind of language. In general, I would strongly advise people not to be intemperate with their speech like that. Certainly not to put it in writing. And there's sort of, we all are kind of aware that there are different ways we talk to people in our families, at our churches, at our places of work. The way we talk to our mistress versus our wife versus our friends. These are all kind of different kind of registers of communication. And I do think there's something kind of wrong about taking communication that was intended in one way and then bringing it up in another context. All that said, I do think that there's a level of being too stupid and that you ultimately will get punished for being so stupid. And I think that that's really what's going on here. It's unfortunate that these people are going to have this issue for the rest of their careers because of Google and whatnot. But it's also kind of a tell that maybe they weren't as elite or serious as they would have thought. But yeah, go ahead, Noided.
Yeah, I would say as a product of Gen Z that if you look into the kind of founts of these of meme culture, all these millennials pining over 4chan days and old Twitter, we're basically seeing that happen on the timeline. People are saying, "Oh, Musk has freed the bird," and now we're living in 4chan world on the timeline. And I would say that if you go back to some of these apps that were introduced to young kids, maybe they didn't start on 4chan. Maybe they started on these apps like 9gag or iFunny. You'll notice that some of these meme apps were owned by Russian people, and some of these ideas would filter out to the youth. So they might not have started on 4chan, but eventually they get there. They find some green text they found funny online. And I would say that identitarianism has been proven to be pushed by figures like Dugan. And it's whenever you hear about Stephen Miller push immigration and build the wall, this is all a part of the same Russian Likud playbook to try to racially awaken people that have a grudge, especially those that are some sort of mutt, or to be frank, some Southern lumpen prole that's trying to fit into the GOP now that it's based to be white
Yeah, the,
presenting.
the argument I've always made to fellow white people is that we should really take over the Democratic Party, and that if history has shown anything recently, it's that women, the candidates, have a hard time. It's really white males that do quite well running for president, with respect to Joe Biden and all of that. So, I'm generally of the view that this kind of racial identity politics, white is too large a category. There are too many diversion factions within it. And yes, I do think that there's a kind of way in which a group of Jews use the white identity issue as a way of making whites unhappy or upset, so that they can collect their votes and then sort of scapegoat them after they voted Republican.
Exactly. And when you look back to the architects of, say, the Goldwater admin or the Southern strategy, they're playing the same playbook. It's almost one to one, the same tactics that they engage in, with people like Phyllis Schlafly and the Coke to Puss and all these people that have been flirting for decades, really with racial rage baiting. Like that's been their playbook for last half a century, 75 years plus at this point. And guess where they get that from? They get that from um, hundreds of years of managing the Soviet Empire and minorities against each other. That's kind of how I see it, where they get this playbook from.
Yeah, there's certainly that famous image of the KGB has of recognizing different faces of like Tartars versus Jews versus Armenians and all of that, and the kind of idea of a nationality or minorities as a kind of divide and conquer approach, which is, I guess, all empires
Yep.
do that to some extent, right, to kind of keep domestic peace. But I've always said that you'll know that the Trump people are serious when Jared Kushner's family properties get raided for being slumlords. or Steve Miller's, father's properties get seized for being slumlords. So there's this kind of use here of having a kind of Jewish control of things like aspects of ICE, or you saw this the other day with Steve Miller says, if I were to put the National Guard here, if I were right, there's that kind of language there of him being in charge, him being kind of America's prime minister. I think it's a very interesting kind of development.
Well, if you notice where Miller came from, the Horowitz Freedom Center, you'll know that a lot of Charlie Kirk himself said that David Horowitz hooked him up with all of his donors to get his group off the ground, and a lot of alt-right people like Milo, like McInnes, like even Spencer, the usual alt-right campus crusaders, they engage in the same playbook that David Horowitz has laid out privately, although publicly he will deny. They'll play the cone card and say, they'll deny in public, but in private they know their playbook.
Yeah, well, I mean, I kind of reject the idea that people can't figure out what white is or that sort of thing. I mean, certainly, people understand the 1790 Naturalization Act from the founding fathers, and people understand, who was segregated from who during Jim Crow. And, a big reason why a lot of white guys are going to be repelled from the Democratic Party is because the Democratic Party keeps saying stuff like, well, white people owe black people reparations and that kind of thing. And I don't think anyone is confused about who they mean. But, unfortunately, because they see that there's a battle between the left and the right, I guess, in politics, and they see that the Democrats in their rhetoric are openly attacking white people, they figure that maybe the GOP will be on their side. But I think we need to enlighten. There are probably tens of millions of people in the United States who do have this racial anxiety, and they are paying taxes, and there is nothing on the GOP for them. Okay, the only thing they get is dog whistles from, Trump saying that he wishes there were more white immigrants or something like that. But nothing ever actually happens. And if someone says something that implies that they are serious about being racial, then of course their organization gets shut down by the GOP, not by the left. So I think tens of millions of Americans need to understand they are paying taxes and they have no representation from any party whatsoever. That just needs to become common knowledge.
In order to herd the mass, the Democratic mass, you need blue healers. So you'll have the squad on one side. You'll have, of which you'll find that they have some strange Russian connections. You'll see Ro Khanna teaming up with Thomas Massie. You'll see the louder Democrats, this horseshoe theory, talking to the peaceniks on the other side, right? These
I mean,
people,
isn't it's pretty well established, though, is it not, that Kahana is like tied in with the Indians
yeah.
and the Hindu Bata and all of that? So it wouldn't surprise me that an Indian, nationalist type would have those connections with the Russian sphere. My just sort of general, and I think we see this obviously with the kind of, some of the issues around Jeffrey Epstein, the kind of like waiving of the Epstein issue, and how that seems to be very much in keeping with like what the Likud wants as a kind of pressure point on Trump. But generally speaking, no, I do think that people have a hard time understanding these things and themselves in racial categories when they're white. And I think that that's, this idea that whites, Puritan stock would have anything in common with Scotch Irish, or that they would in turn have anything in common with, different aspects of the white population. I think that, there really was a civil war fought between whites. So this idea that, you know, identity is going to work in that way, I think is kind of mistaken. I think more likely what's going to happen is that both political parties are going to reassess their relationship with the Likud and with Jews generally. And you can kind of see that already playing out in the New York elections, where, Mamdani looks likely to get 20 points, plus over Cuomo. And I think when that happens, it's going to be a real sea change within the Democratic Party. And I think what you'll start to see is, you'll start to see the fleeing of various Jews for Florida and for other parts unknown. But New York, on the whole, I think will be just fine. New York will ultimately rejigger itself and reset itself. And as I said to somebody from New York today, who's sort of a Politico type, there, I said, there was a period where Italians were in New York. There was a period where Irish were in New York. There's a period where Jews were in New York, and now there's going to be a period now where Muslims run New York. And it seems likely to me that, Mamdani is very likely to get, potential financial backing from the various Gulf Arabs and other players out there simply because he's a Muslim, and simply because, they like the idea of New York, like London, being dominated by a Muslim mayor. And I think that's not a crazy idea as time goes on. And we should also be kind of aware that, there's been a kind of hostility on the part of Jewish power centers in Los Angeles, in New York, elsewhere, really barring the building of new developments, really kind of rent seeking when it comes to housing policy and urban policy generally. And I think we're going to start seeing more pushback against that. And I think the left wing Likud players like Ezra Klein and others have really gone out of their way to kind of create this narrative of abundance. But really, it's the issue is that there's a group of Jews in a lot of these places who own a lot of real estate. And what they're trying to do is jack up both the population, which they have imported. That was really the kind of untold story of the Biden years, is the way in which there was a lot of human trafficking, led by Israelis and by Russians as a kind of pressure point on Biden. Um, and of course, nobody really talks about that. It's sort of like moving people to the border into Texas, and then there was a lot of Likudnik supporters of Abbott and of DeSantis and others who were taking those people and bringing them up to New York as a way of jacking the rents in New York as commercial real estate was falling apart. Sort of residential rents. So I think we're going to see kind of a lot more of this kind of discussion as time goes on, of like who really runs New York, who's in charge. And I think what in effect will happen is that there'll be a kind of retirement of the Chuck Schumers within the Democratic Party, and that we really reached. We'll maybe look back in time and realize that October 7th, 2023 was kind of peak Zionism, and that we're kind of in the denouement now.
Would you say that Jon Stewart is in that camp of the abundance
Oh yeah, the
Likudniks?
left wing Likud issue. Yeah, you start to see it a lot of places. It's a kind of like where they'll promote each other's businesses. They'll sort of promote each other's cultural power by being in certain networks. Will promote each other over others. And yeah, there is this issue, and we see it on Wall Street as well, where Jewish firms like to just trade amongst each other. And there's a kind of ethnic nepotism that takes place, and I think people are increasingly tired of that. And I think it's increasingly not really working in a meaningful way. And I think venture capital is kind of one of the last vestiges of it. I think it's sort of failing in all kinds of elaborate ways. And certainly, the Silicon Valley tech bro kind of culture of AI and all of that is sort of falling apart, is my impression of things. I think it'll be interesting to see who gets blamed for the AI bubble, right? When it finally pops and sort of takes a big chunk of the stock market with it. Who will be the sort of scapegoat of that?
Yeah, you're seeing the All In Pod actually address this circular funding problem that you see. NVIDIA feeds into the larger AI mass as it continues to grow. And, they say 10 years out, we're going to have AGI, but that's because they want to make more money. This whole, what do they call it? Stargates. It's pretty on the nose. It's with Ellison and the lot. It's a strange money laundering scheme, but it will. I mean, you're seeing cracks in the foundation with this Bitcoin thing coming up, being so volatile. All these fake assets, supposedly. It's just the whole surrounding infrastructure is on shaky ground for sure.
Well, I mean, you have this sort of issue generally of people having higher electricity bills because of the AI issue, and it's sort of driving up energy prices. And I think maybe that's the point of it, right? Is that a lot of these countries that give, the Jewish oligarchs money, be they Saudi Arabia, be they Qatar, they're all kind of petrostates, energy states. And so they need a higher global price of energy. And the AI stuff delivers that. But of course, like, if you're a normal person, you want costs to go down. Like you want healthcare, housing, all of that to go down and not be as expensive as it has been in the past. And increasingly, electricity is quite expensive. So I think, it kind of ties into this other point of the show notes. People have been asking me a lot about what I think about Aptera. I've written about Aptera. I'm an investor in Aptera. It's the solar powered car company. Um, and I will be selling some assets tomorrow to go put more money into Aptera. And I'm generally very pro these electric car solutions that are non-Elon related. Solar power cars, in my view, kind of don't tax the grid as much. For those who are kind of unaware, I'll kind of put some stuff up in the Jumbotron about Aptera, but it went public yesterday, and I'm pretty excited about it. I think it's maybe a sign of things to come. It has had a kind of rough um, go of things, but we're going to see a sort of fight, I think, um, between this sort of like Tesla bros on the one hand, and the sort of rise of Aptera on the other hand. My sense, for what it's worth, is that we're at this moment where there's a kind of Silicon Valley collapse coming, whether it's the defense tech players on the one hand, which is the Palmer, Anduril, Palantir, Peter Thiel world, or the fake AI stuff as exhibited by Sam Altman and sort of all that stuff attendant to that, or it's the sort of Tesla, situation. And I believe there's a number of investigations going on of Tesla as we speak, and so I think that's going to be very interesting to see as time goes on.
Isn't Elon like 100% behind solar though?
Isn't he 100% behind what? Say again, Sherry.
Sorry. Yeah, he's bullish on solar and he's like all in on solar, isn't he? Still, he's not into like nuclear or fossil fuel.
Well, I mean, he said he's pro solar, but if you look at the design, the energy efficiency design of like the Tesla vehicles versus the Aptera, it kind of gives you a sense of it. The Aptera is sort of a car that has solar panels built into the vehicle itself. And so I believe Musk was running some kind of solar scam around Solar City, which I think his cousins ran, if I recall correctly. And there's obviously the question of like, how energy dense are the batteries? Where does he source a lot of the battery refinement? It's largely China, that kind of thing. And I think what we're starting to see with Tesla is we're starting to see the kind of wheels are coming off of the Musk kind of enterprise. And so it'll be, you sort of notice Musk has been a lot quieter than he's been in the past. And I think that that's going to be an extremely fascinating kind of development as time goes on.
So you think it's like a strategic blunder for him not to go onto this sort of onboard power generation, but rather go in the battery route, which are heavy, obviously, and require lots of power, puts more weight on the car.
That's right. That's kind of my interpretation of things. I also think, just generally speaking, we probably have hit peak car in the West and in the world generally. And there's this question of like, how much can we continue to afford a lot of these things? And the question, of course, is the Aptera a sort of recession, a recession car? Is that where things are going long run? And I suspect we're going to see a lot more densification across the board. That's kind of what this abundance agenda is about. And we're also going to see a lot more, electric car pushing by our deep state and by other countries' deep states. Somebody told me recently that Norway is going like 100% EV, which is a kind of interesting hedge for one of the world's top oil producers. And I think we're going to see more of that
Yeah.
as time goes on.
It's funny. I think the Norwegians already have got the highest adaptation of solar cars. Like half the cars are Teslas on the road, and it's it's kind of hypocritical. But that's not the first country that would have engaged in something like
My
that. I think this.
is that
Yeah, I think
yeah, go
the
ahead.
big question is the self-driving capability. So if that actually starts working, then we probably need like maximum 30% of the cars on the road, because people will just be calling a self-driving taxi to go anywhere. You can get drunk as well.
Yeah, I think none of that's going to happen. And if you look at like a lot of the criminal investigations, I think we're going to see more of that as time goes on. You're going to see a lot more criminal investigations into the self-driving car frauds that have gone on. I believe that there's investigation at the SEC is already with respect to Musk and all of this. So I think we're going to see more of that as time goes on.
Hey,
Well, wait, hold on a second. Like in the city that I live in, there's already self-driving cars everywhere. There's like if you drive from any place to any other place in my city, you'll pass by at least 2 or 3 of them.
I think the issue is that what velocities they go at and what the companies claim about their self-driving capabilities. And in the case of, there are people who've been killed by these, so-called self-driving cars. And yeah, there have been lawsuits about it. NHTSA's gotten involved with it. So I think just because something's out on the road doesn't mean it's going to stay out on the road for forever.
hey, I just want to jump in real quick on the topic of like AI, Silicon Valley, fake tech and stuff. I've noticed this genre of post on X since Elon took over, of this like hype slop, kind of FOMO type of thing, where people make these very over exaggerated, hyperbolic claims about Bitcoin and like we're here, we're in the singularity. I just made a post about it on my account. For an example of what I'm saying, this stuff is pushed primarily by like Indians, I've noticed. Um, Sorry, I'm kind of nervous right now. I don't usually speak, but this kind of content just strikes me as something that you wouldn't be promoting if like this technology was really real. Um, but yeah, it's just this very specific genre of content. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this type of post. It seems kind of like a psychological sort of thing, Charles.
Yeah, I agree totally with what you're saying. I think it's designed to jack up the price of Tesla.
Yeah, and Elon, he's been saying we're gonna have full self-driving this year since like 2022. I remember in early 2023, I was watching a video where he said this year, and it's been 3 years and it hasn't come out yet. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my view is that, if you drive up the cost of Tesla, if you drive up the prices of Teslas by talking about self-driving, that's what will drive a lot of the stock boost, and then he can borrow against that. In other words, I think it's a stock scam, if you want to be technical about it. And that there's a lot of these Indians who are pushing the stock scam because, he has relationships with the Indians. That's a
Do you do you think this exists to benefit Tesla specifically? Because I know this content is very specific to crypto and AI specifically in general, not just full self-driving, but it's specifically Bitcoin, crypto, and AI that this like hype slop is what I call it, is
Yeah, I
centered
mean, I
around.
think all of those things rest upon, certain assumptions about the world. So in the case of Tesla and the self-driving issue, we do have this issue of people dying in these fake self-driving car situations. And so there's a liability question there around people dying from the cars. And then, if you're pushing this idea of Tesla, 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 self-driving, 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 then you will get a certain portion of the world to basically buy into that And that's before you get into the other questions around, certain countries buying the stock of Tesla, certain players benefiting from it. If you're India, you like Elon because Elon hires a lot of H-1B visa workers, which is useful to you, and it sort of like puts you at the center of things. So, from my perspective, the crypto stuff is really just about Ponzi scheme economics, right? If you make crypto appear really normal everywhere all at once, you'll get a certain percentage of people that have FOMO that convert their money into crypto. And then on the AI front, I think it's about this global price of electricity being higher and how that's net beneficial for certain oligarchs and certain people who own, coal and electricity production generally. If we're entering a period where global energy prices contract or go down, that's a real problem for a lot of these players just generally.
With the AI stuff, I think that the self-driving car and the AI are kind of linked together, but the blockchain and the Bitcoin world is kind of a different. But I'm wondering what happens to AI when these large language models start taking advertising money. If they're not already taking advertising, the whole thing will collapse, right?
Yeah, I mean, my just general view is that advertising on the internet is effectively going away because of this issue of all this fake content. And because you can't really see who's actually watching it or reading it, and so you can't really capture the advertising revenue in quite the same way. So there's a lot of ad fraud that goes on in different ways. So yeah, I think it's a growing concern. My sense just generally is that I think Elon or Tesla generally is going to continue to get in trouble with law enforcement, with sort of a number of kind of criminal investigations that are going on. And I think that that's going to become more apparent as time goes on. Let me see here. I'm going to pull up. Yeah, so there's like a Tesla fraud investigation. So yeah, I mean here, Tesla, Elon Musk sued by shareholders over robotaxi claims. That's August 5, 2025. Which is sued for securities fraud, right? Tesla's robotaxis are driving over curbs and into courtrooms. It's not going great. Tesla must face customer classes and self-driving fraud suit. Tesla faces $68 billion stock hit as robotaxi lawsuit safety cover up. Um, Tesla denies Canadian allegations of subsidy fraud. So there's just like a lot of like fraud issues showing up Tesla, and I think that that's going to become more apparent as time goes on. So the question is like, who's going to be the scapegoat of this kind of market turn down, and that's going to be a kind of big question, I think, going forward.
Well, I'm curious how much of this attack on Elon Musk is driven by some kind of ethnic nepotism, okay? Because he started getting, attacked by things like the SEC and all that right after he did this disastrous tweet years ago where he said, don't you know who owns the media? Right. And of course, that caused a huge firestorm. All of the people were drawing the obvious conclusions from it. That's when he had to go do his penance. He had to go to Auschwitz and put on the kippah and be ordered around by
So
Ben Shapiro.
I think that entire thing was a kind of control file thing. So it was working on both sides of it. He gets banned on the one hand from getting advertising dollars for X, and then on the other hand, he has various groups like the Netanyahu crew come and sort of grab him and make him one of them. But I think in the main, they're trying to control Tesla and they're trying to control Musk because he's a huge player. And you saw Netanyahu interview Musk and talk about him being the unofficial president of the United States. And people like Darren Beatty and others were encouraging Musk to sue people and to do lawfare against them. And I think we're seeing more of that as time goes on as well. I pointed this out. People aren't kind of like glommed onto what it means. But in my lawsuit by Hal Lambert, Hal Lambert does business with Elon Musk's associates parties with them at Austin parties, and his lawyers in this case, lawyers he can't really afford, are the same lawyers that Musk uses, at DLA Piper and Quinn Emanuel. So I think it's going to be really interesting as time goes on, as this stuff becomes more apparent, that this is a kind of op being run and generated. And so I think what we'll start to see is, we'll start to see some correction in Tesla's price. As time goes on, we'll see kind of more and more going on, and I think it'll become more and more involved as time goes on. So yeah, I think it's going to be quite fascinating. It'll be a lot of fun when it's all said and done, with Elon stuff and the Sam Altman stuff and all that stuff blows up. I am not a critic of Larry Ellison. I know that people have this view that generally, like, one should be skeptical of all these things, but my read is that Ellison is very much America guy in dealing with the Israelis and dealing with other players. And so I don't really have an issue with an American billionaire, being the money going into the IDF and all of that. I don't see evidence of Ellison being, pushing all kinds of stuff like the Likudniks want. In fact, on the contrary, I see a lot of evidence of him just trying to get everything into Oracle, and Oracle has all kinds of backdoors with the U.S. government. So I'm not an Ellison hater.
Yeah, and you've got like Elon is African,
Well, wait,
right?
I'm,
And
I'm curious.
he's
Can I
got
ask
like
real quick?
all dependencies in China and all these other places. I'll leave it there.
So, Charles, I'm curious if you believe that Barry Weiss is a significant media talent.
I don't. I believe that what Ellison is doing in hiring her. So first of all, it's David Ellison that hired her, not Larry Ellison, and obviously that's an important distinction. My read is that David Ellison is being sort of set up to fail, and that Larry Ellison is sort of the main player, the main shot caller. And so, no, I've known Barry Weiss a number of years. I've written about her at my Substack. I've known her, like, I used to work under her when I was at the Wall Street Journal. And like, I think she's very much a part of the Israeli scam world. But what's happening is people are seeing, now that CBS is controlled by the Ellison, David Ellison, they're starting to see, they're starting to see Barry Weiss do all this nepotistic stuff, like put her sister out there. And I think a lot of these people are being much more exposed as time goes on. And I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
Sorry, who is David Ellison?
David Ellison is the son of Larry Ellison, who's the one who put together the group that bought Viacom, and that in turn owns CBS. I know Barry. Barry made a lot of errors when she was at the Wall Street Journal. She has a hard time fact-checking things. And I think what she's doing, in effect, is she's going to end up making the kind of errors that are going to lead to CBS getting sued and then shut down. So I actually think, in a weird way, the Ellisons are our friends by elevating the Barry Weisses of the world into positions where they can't succeed.
Well, you have to admit it doesn't look like that, right? You could understand somebody drawing the obvious conclusions from that because, Barry Weiss and Larry Ellison, they do have things in common, and people are going to notice that.
Yeah, so I don't have that view, just to be blunt about it. So I don't think that all Jews like get along. In fact, on the contrary, my dealings with a lot of Jews is that Jews don't get along, that they actually fight with each other a lot more. And in the case of Ellison, the history of Larry Ellison is much more interesting, much more varied, much more complicated. Larry Ellison has said a lot of like anti-Jewish things over the years and anti-religious Jewish things. And so and he's also half Italian. So like, how does that play into it? And then Barry Weiss is, she's from a certain kind of Russian Jewish background, which isn't always necessarily aligned with the German Jewish background. And so, my view has always been like, two Jews, three opinions. Now, that's not to say that I think there isn't a kind of ethnic identity, a kind of ethnic nepotism that takes place among Jews. I think that's certainly true, but I think we kind of overstate it a lot of times. And in the final analysis, Barry Weiss is not very talented at what she does, and she's been elevated to a position of prominence and attention that I think is going to lead to her getting in serious trouble. And I think that's a good thing. And I think it will reveal itself over time. The way I've kind of think about these things is that, what is the real thing what is the real thing that's going on here? What's going on is that Larry Ellison is being allowed to buy TikTok for $14 billion, which is effectively a pittance. And he's being, he's done all these favors for Trump by having his son acquire various properties like CBS. And I think a lot of this is just a favor trading kind of exercise. He cares obviously a lot more about like the future of Oracle than he cares about, say, the future of CBS News. And if CBS under Barry Weiss makes all these errors, and I wrote about her historically making errors back when I worked with her. She would publish her friends. She'd fuck up in all these elaborate ways. And I think as that becomes more clear that she's a fuck up, that's going to actually redound to the benefit of a lot of us who criticized her in the first place. So,
Well, he's buying TikTok, following a lot of noise about how TikTok is turning people into anti-Semites, right? I mean,
yeah, I
that's
mean,
that's the context here.
this is the argument.
And then he's elevating Barry Weiss. I mean, you could understand why somebody would take the
Yeah,
position that
and
he's
I think
just
that take
being
is wrong. So, like, I want to be clear about why I think it's wrong. So, one, I don't think that TikTok made all these people anti-Semitic. I think the actions of Israel murdering a bunch of like men, women, and children in Gaza is what moved people in the direction of being critical of the Israelis. So, I don't think that TikTok like alone did it. I think in general, Gen Z is much more skeptical of the Israelis, and both Republican and Democrat alike. I don't think it's TikTok. I'm not a huge view that technology determines these realities. And it's I certainly don't own a TikTok account. I've been critical of the Israelis for quite a number of years now. People are starting to just see how they behave in Twitter and elsewhere, and it's bothering them, and they're moving in a kind of understandable Israel skeptical direction. I think that's all very well and good. So this idea that Netanyahu and crew had, they very much wanted a monopoly on social media. They in effect controlled Facebook through their agent Sheryl Sandberg, who is very involved with the Israeli cause. And Facebook, a number of these platforms, in effect, promoted a kind of Zionist Likud view of the world. And when TikTok showed up and was more popular, had the backing of the Chinese state, reflected Chinese interests. And that was an issue where a lot of the Silicon Valley guys wanted to be the only arbiter of tech. They didn't want anyone moving outside of the Facebook ecosystem. And so my view, just generally, for what it's worth over the next, few years or so, is that, generally speaking, I think social media is going to wane in influence. It's not going to be as important as it once was because people can go to many different platforms to get their message out. And you're starting to see this with like podcasters or talent being able to go to many different platforms. The days in which you could kind of be like suppressed everywhere, they're not really working. I mean, you could see this with Nick Fuentes. Nick Fuentes is arguably the most banned person out there, and yet he's able to go to all these different places, carry his message. His message is interesting and compelling, in part because it's banned and blocked. So, this idea that I certainly think that there was a political constituency that wanted to ban TikTok because, they were worried about people leaving Facebook. They were worried about people leaving Instagram. But what ended up happening is that Larry Ellison, in acquiring it and controlling it, he achieved the U.S. government objective, which was to keep a Chinese property out of America, or at least in certain American hands. And he sort of squared that circle. So I think he was sort of useful in that way. And he got it for a relatively cheap amount of money. I mean, he got it for like $14 billion, which is, it's functionally nothing.
There's a law now that they've set in Australia which bans the use of social media from under 16s. So
Yeah, and I think,
if they,
Sherry, are
yeah,
you based in Australia?
mate, I don't want to
Oh, you don't
locate
want to say
myself if
anything. All
that's all
right.
right.
Well, fair enough. I think just generally speaking, the Australians are kind of ahead of us on a lot of these issues, and I think just like we saw with a lot of age verification around porn, we're starting to see that's really harming a lot of the pornographers. I think we're going to start seeing age verifications go on and real identities start going on across social media and elsewhere, and I think that's a good thing. We should support it.
Yeah, it was already in the news that Google is saying, "Oh, but this is very hard to implement." So that was the news I spotted last week. I think the law goes into action by the end of the year.
Yeah, my general view is that Australia is one of those places where a lot of these ideas get tried out first. Just like, the Five Eyes countries, a lot of technology gets deployed in certain places first. And I think that's a good thing in the main. So I'm generally in support of it.
Yeah, any parent is in support of it for sure.
Yeah, and I think any sort of serious person, sort of understands that as well. I think it's a kind of obvious thing that needs to be going in a certain direction. My general view is that younger generations understand the degree to which social media takes advantage of them and doesn't really give them anything for it. And I think they saw their older, millennial relatives get harmed from social media, and they didn't really want to interact with it as well. So I think it's a very good thing that's happening, where people are moving in a more hostile direction to these platforms, and I think we'll see more of it as time goes on. So I think, unless there's anyone else has anything they want to say, we'll kind of open it up to more questions or more people just generally. If you have anything you want to say, feel free to raise your hand. I'll bring you up. And we can maybe chat for maybe like 15, 20 more minutes. Otherwise, I will see you soon. If there's anything I didn't get into, I might have missed a few topics. Oh, I thought Nick did extremely well on Alex Jones's show. I'm enjoying the generational run. Nick, as people know, Nick and I are friends. I like Nick. Thought very well of him for a long time. He is a very impressive young man. I do worry he's maybe a bit more exposed than he should be, and I'm a little worried about his just safety, just as a friend. There was that situation where that guy showed up at his house, tried to kill him. Obviously, disgusting and disturbing, and so I am worried generally about his just general safety. But in general, I think he's doing a very good job. I'm kind of curious to see, the kind of collaborations he has going forward, and I think it's good to see what he's up to. Yeah, go ahead, Noided.
Yeah,
Go ahead and
what do you
go get a
think?
hot dog.
What do you think this development with King Charles in the Catholic Church? You're seeing a lot more Catholic influence trying to exert itself in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm generally supportive of. I'm an Anglican or Episcopalian Church of England goer. I have a lot of family that's Catholic. I generally respect the Catholic Church quite a bit, and I think it's a good thing to have the king is dying. The King Charles is dying from all accounts, and so I think it's a good idea to have the leader, basically the leaders of Christendom, accepting the Orthodox world, but the leaders of Christendom, meeting up together, chatting, talking about the future of the world. I think that's all very good.
What do you think of Russia's influence in a lot of these like the TLM and this push for ecumenicalism? Do you think that's a larger good, or do you think that they have an interest in this?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a lot of Russian influences in the trad movement generally. I think the reason the Pope bans you know, is effectively banning Opus Dei. I think that's a good thing generally. And I like that the Vatican is largely cleaning itself up. I think that's to be encouraged, really. But yeah, there's all kinds of weird Russian angles that approach, the Tories in the UK, or the sort of, trad Caths, as well. So yeah, I think it's an issue, but I think it's one that's well in hand. Go ahead, Hot Dog Yellow.
Hey, I've been listening the whole time. I was big fan, by the way. Anyways, you haven't talked about Maduro or like Venezuela or anything. Do you have anything to say about
Yeah,
that?
I'm probably going to save it for next week or so, but I have some ideas on Venezuela. As people may know, I think I've talked about this before in these spaces, but I've been to Venezuela. I try to. It's always challenging to talk about Latin America related stuff because I have family that lives in Latin America and was former, Intel and all of that. So I'm always kind of like a little hesitant to get into it. But I think basically, my view is that um, there's a kind of global problem here, which is that the price of oil is decreasing. Venezuela on the whole is like very sanctioned. There's all these people in Venezuela that are coming to the US as in effect slaves. And I think that this is a kind of regional powder keg. And whether, what kind of deal we can work out with Maduro kind of remains to be seen. I would prefer that we not engage in a military situation there. Excuse me. Situation there. And I'll probably have more to say, over the weekend because I'm sort of thinking it through. What should be the right approach to dealing with Venezuela? Obviously, it's a place that has tremendous resources. It has a kind of rich history. It's got, I think, something like 40 million people. So it's a country that really, should be closer to the U.S. in different ways. But whether it will be or not, I think is kind of an open question. Go ahead, Austin.
Hey, Charles, can you hear me?
We can. Yeah, go ahead.
I have two questions for you. So the first question is, what is Nick Fuentes' ideology exactly? Because I'm having issues with understanding the ideology. I've listened to him for a year now, and I'm just
I,
curious of
I don't
what
know that
your
he
take of
I don't
his
know that he
ideology
has
is.
yeah, I don't know that he has an ideology other than what he would say is America first. I think what's happening a lot among the younger generations is they're just not as interested in this like right left kind of thing that older generations got kind of like, forced into or advanced into. They tend to be much more interested in kind of personality driven news, much more interested in personality driven figures. That's why they talk about things like aura, and they're less ideological on the whole. So I would say, he's a Catholic, pro American type. He, likes to be a social commentator. I don't particularly even see him as terribly right wing. I think he's kind of more small c conservative in his personal habits. It was kind of funny watching him with Alex Jones, where Alex Jones was trying to convince, young Fuentes about the virtues of women. I thought that was a kind of funny segment. I don't know if anyone's seen that, but it's kind of it's kind of like the old buck talking to the young buck. But yeah, I think he has a compelling fan base, and it's a bit strange to have somebody who's your friend who becomes like suddenly very famous overnight. But I wish him well. I have nothing but respect for him, and I think really well of him. Actually, I think he's been a tremendous voice of moving the country in all kinds of interesting ways, and I look forward to see where he goes from here.
The second
Uh,
question was Patrick Casey. What
Yeah,
what was
Casey is
his
very
what is
much
his
he's very
lore like?
Yeah, he's very much in the kind of Israeli Zionist camp. He was kind of one of these, white nationalist types that moved into basically being their bitch, and that's really kind of what he is. I don't really respect Patrick Casey. The feeling is somewhat mutual, from what I understand. But yeah, I think he's not really anywhere in the same camp as a Nick Fuentes. He's the kind of step and fetch it for certain parts of the Zionist agenda, is my read on him. I don't know if that's helpful to you, but let's do like one or two more questions and then we'll kind of call it an evening. Go ahead, Sherry.
okay, I have a question. Uh, what is this? Trump is offering asylum to white Europeans who are anti-mass immigration. Is this like any grounding in reality?
No, I think a lot of that is just for the bubbas. I don't think that's a really serious proposal. I don't think it would really work legally, but I think it's a way of like signaling that, oh, you're on the quote unquote right side or something like that. But no, I don't think anything's really going to come of that. I think it's kind of fake for what it's worth. Anything else? No, going once, going twice. All right, I guess I'll see you guys all. I'll probably do a show on Monday or Tuesday. I like doing the ones later in the evening. For those who are unaware, we've recorded this. We'll put it up, on Substack if you want to share it around with other people. Mr. Producer will sort of handle that. And if you have any kind of questions or, you want to get involved or whatever, feel free to message me. And we'll be doing more of this in the near future. And I hope you guys all have a very good weekend and we'll catch up later. Take care.